The homeless ex-wife entered in handcuffs, humiliated and alone. The millionaire judge didn't even look up until he heard her name. Suddenly, he froze. The past came rushing back in full force. And before everyone, the entire courtroom was shocked by what came next. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The clock struck 8 in the morning when Judge Richard Mitchell entered the courtroom at the Manhattan Criminal Court. As usual, he adjusted the black robe over his broad shoulders and took his seat, preparing for another day of trials. At 45, his face bore the marks of someone who had dedicated his life to the judiciary, and in his brown eyes the sparkle of someone who still believed in justice, even after 2 decades in his career. The stack of case files on his desk no longer intimidated him. They were stories that repeated themselves, petty crimes, misdemeanors, cases that rarely required more than a few minutes of attention. However, something felt different that morning. An indefinable premonition had accompanied him since he woke up, as if the universe was conspiring for something he didn't yet understand. The first hearing of the day was about to begin. His assistant, Ms. Celia, a gray-haired lady who had been with him for years, entered the room carrying a thin folder. "Judge, it's a simple trespassing case. The defendant is being brought in now." Richard adjusted his reading glasses and opened the case file distractedly. His eyes automatically scanned the first page until something made him stop. His heart raced when he read the defendant's name, Helen Fields. That name, which he had tried to bury in the depths of his memories for so long, now jumped off the paper like a materialized ghost. The doors of the courtroom opened, and 2 court officers led in a woman. Richard had to hold onto the desk and avoid showing his shock. Helen, who had once been his wife, now stood before him unrecognizable. Her once golden hair was disheveled and lifeless. Her dirty and worn clothes hung on a body that was much too thin. Her eyes, which had once enchanted him, were now dull, lost in an emptiness he couldn't comprehend. The prosecutor, Paul Rivers, began reading the charges with his usual indifference. The defendant was detained in the early hours of the 15th, when she was found sleeping in the outdoor area of Bella Vita restaurant, using cardboard boxes as shelter. When questioned, she presented neither identification nor a fixed address. Richard observed Helen, who remained with her head down, showing no reaction. Where was that vibrant woman he had known? The dedicated teacher who spent hours preparing lessons, who dreamed of transforming the world through education? How had she reached this state? Involuntary memories began to invade his mind. The first time he saw her at law school, where she was studying literature in the building next door. The simple but hopeful wedding. The shared dreams, the first arguments, the silent wear that corroded their relationship, the pride that prevented them from seeking help, the separation that happened like a whisper, without shouting or drama, just a void that grew until nothing remained. "Your Honor?" The prosecutor's voice brought him back to reality. "We await your ruling on the absent defense counsel." Richard realized he needed to make a decision. He couldn't simply follow protocol, not with Helen there so vulnerable, but he also couldn't ignore his position as a judge. The conflict between professional duty and resurfacing emotions threatened his ability to maintain composure. With slightly trembling hands, he took a piece of paper and quickly wrote a note. He called Ms. Celia and whispered, "Deliver this to Frank Newman, it's urgent." Frank was more than a respected lawyer. He was a symbol of overcoming adversity. Having lived on the streets during his youth, he had managed to transform his life through study and determination. Now, at 50, he dedicated part of his time to social causes, giving back to society the help he had once received. While waiting, Richard tried to stay calm. He observed Helen discreetly, noticing every detail of her decline. How had he allowed this to happen? Why had he never tried to find out about her after the separation? The weight of guilt began to mix with a profound sadness. 15 minutes passed until Frank entered the courtroom. His impeccable suit contrasted with the expression of curiosity on his face. Upon seeing Helen, something in his eyes changed. Richard recognized that look. It was the same one Frank had when he met someone who, like him once, needed a chance. "Your Honor, I request a 30-minute recess to speak with my client," Frank asked, immediately assuming the defense. Richard granted the request, watching as Frank gently led Helen out of the courtroom. When he was alone, he allowed himself a moment of weakness. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes, trying to contain the emotions that threatened to overflow. In the courthouse hallway, Frank led Helen to a room reserved for client meetings. The austere environment, with its white walls and functional furniture, seemed even colder in contrast to the fragility of his new client. He offered her water and waited patiently until she felt more comfortable to speak. "Ms. Helen," he began gently, "can you tell me your story?" For a few moments she remained silent, as if she needed to gather strength to make the words emerge. When she finally spoke, her voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper. "I was a teacher, a long time ago." Frank realized that each word seemed to cost her an immense effort. With kindness, he guided the conversation, allowing Helen to reveal her story little by little, like someone untying a very old knot. "After my mother fell ill, everything changed," she continued, now with watery eyes. "The treatment consumed all our savings. I tried to keep giving private lessons, but I needed to be with her all the time. When she passed away, the debts were already too large." As Helen spoke, Frank took notes discreetly. His experience told him there was much more to this story than a simple case of trespassing. The woman before him bore the marks of someone who had once been on the other side of life, someone who had known better days. "Do you have any relatives we can contact?" Helen gave a sad smile. "I have no one. After the divorce..." Her voice failed and she didn't complete the sentence. Frank noticed how she avoided mentioning her ex-husband directly. Was it possible that she hadn't recognized the judge? Or was she just trying to protect herself from another wound? "Helen," he said, leaning slightly, "I need you to trust me. How long have you been living on the streets?" "I've lost count. Maybe 2 years. 3. The days start to blend together after a while." She nervously adjusted the hem of her worn blouse. "At first, I was still able to stay in some boarding houses. I worked as a cleaner, a maid. But then I got sick. Without documents, without a fixed address, no one would give me work anymore." Frank felt his heart tighten. How many similar stories had he witnessed? People who, through a series of circumstances, ended up falling into a spiral of exclusion from which it was almost impossible to escape alone. "Did you try to seek help? Any social service shelter?" "I tried. Once I came here to the courthouse." Helen ran her hand through her disheveled hair. "I wanted to talk to, well, someone I knew. But the security guard wouldn't even let me in. He said people like me had no place here." Frank felt his blood boil. How many times had he himself in his youth been barred from places because of his appearance? How was that prejudice still embedded in the institutions that should protect the most vulnerable? He stood up and walked to the window, needing a moment to organize his thoughts. Outside, the city continued its frantic pace, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within those walls. When he turned back to Helen, there was determination in his gaze. "I will take your defense," he declared. "And not just for this case. We'll recover your documents, seek your rights. You are not alone anymore." For the first time since entering the room, Helen raised her eyes, meeting Frank's. There was something different there. Perhaps a small spark of hope. "Why are you helping?" "Me?" Frank smiled gently. "Because someone one day also extended a hand to me when I needed it most. And because your story doesn't end here, Helen. This is just a new beginning." Checking his watch, he realized that the recess time was almost over. They needed to return to the courtroom, where he knew a judge tormented by his own ghosts awaited them. Frank was aware that the case was much more complex than it appeared at first glance. It wasn't just about a woman who had sought shelter on a cold night. It was about redemption, second chances, and the invisible ties that continued to bind people even after years of separation. "Let's go back," he said, standing up. "Trust me, Helen. Things are going to change from now on." As they walked back to the courtroom, Frank was already mentally mapping out his strategy. He knew he would need to carefully balance the legal and human aspects of the case, and most importantly, he would need to deal with the delicate situation of having a judge emotionally involved with the defendant, even if she didn't yet seem to have noticed this fact. The return to the courtroom was marked by a dense silence. Frank positioned himself next to Helen, while Judge Richard kept his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, avoiding any eye contact that might betray his personal involvement with the case. "Your Honor," Frank began, his firm voice echoing through the room, "I request that it be noted on the record that I officially assume the defense of Ms. Helen Fields. Furthermore, I request time to present documents that will prove her previous history as an educator and her record of volunteer work." Prosecutor. Paul Rivers adjusted himself in his chair, visibly uncomfortable with the presence of such a renowned lawyer in an apparently simple case. "I object, Your Honor. This is a flagrant case with unequivocal evidence. There is no need for evidentiary extension." It was at this moment that Ms. Celia hurriedly entered the courtroom, interrupting the hearing. In her hands, a sealed brown envelope addressed to Judge Richard Mitchell with the inscription "Urgent" in red letters. The judge frowned as he received the document, his face subtly paling as he read its contents. It was an anonymous letter, typed with threatening precision. "Dear Judge Mitchell, we know of your previous relationship with the defendant. If you do not declare yourself disqualified by tomorrow, the Judicial Council will receive a complete dossier on your personal involvement with the case. We suggest you preserve your reputation." Richard felt his blood freeze in his veins. Who could know? How had someone discovered so quickly? His hands trembled slightly as he placed the letter in the drawer, trying to maintain composure in front of those present. "Continue, Mr. Newman," he said, his voice betraying a slight tremor. The lawyer, noticing the sudden change in the judge's behavior, decided to change his strategy. "Gentlemen, my client is not just another number in our statistics. Helen Fields was a teacher for 15 years, dedicating her life to educating underprivileged children. I have here," and he removed some yellow documents from his briefcase, "records of her work in the Light of Knowledge project, where she taught literacy to more than 200 children in vulnerable communities." Helen, upon hearing the name of the project, raised her head slightly. That had been the happiest time of her life, when she genuinely believed she could make a difference in the world. Furthermore, Frank continued, her current situation is the result of a series of systemic failures. After caring for her mother, during a prolonged illness, she faced financial difficulties that led her to lose her home. She tried to seek help from institutions, including this very courthouse, but was barred due to structural prejudices. Prosecutor Paul Rivers fidgeted uneasily in his chair. The case that had seemed so simple was beginning to take on more complex contours. Even so, Your Honor, the law is clear regarding trespassing on private property. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. Helen, who had remained silent until then, began to cough violently. Her fragile body shook with each spasm, and before anyone could react, she fainted, falling onto her defense table. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Frank was the first to support her, while Ms. Celia ran to call for medical help. Richard, momentarily, forgetting his role as a judge, rose abruptly, his face marked by the concern he was trying to contain. "Call an ambulance," he ordered, his voice betraying the anguish he was trying to control. Minutes later, paramedics rushed into the courtroom. While providing first aid, one of them announced, "Her blood pressure is very low and she has a high fever. We need to take her to the hospital immediately." Frank accompanied his client to the ambulance, but before leaving, he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, in light of these facts, I request the immediate suspension of the hearing and that urgent measures be taken to ensure appropriate medical treatment for my client." Richard, still visibly shaken, mechanically nodded. "Hearing suspended. Let all necessary measures be taken for the medical care of the defendant, of Ms. Fields." When the courtroom finally emptied, Richard remained seated, staring fixedly at the place where Helen had been. The anonymous letter weighed in his drawer like lead, but now a greater concern occupied his thoughts. the health status of the woman who had once been his companion. At Mercy Hospital, Helen was immediately taken to the emergency room. Frank waited in the hallway, alternating between phone calls and notes in his inseparable notepad. His mind worked rapidly, connecting dots and planning the next steps. A young doctor, Dr. Beth Sanders, approached him with a clipboard in her hands. Are you responsible for patient Helen Fields? I'm her lawyer, Frank responded, standing up. How is she? We found a severe case of malnutrition, along with untreated pneumonia. She also shows signs of post-traumatic stress and severe depression. The doctor paused, adjusting her glasses. We'll need to keep her hospitalized for a few days. As they conversed, an unusual commotion took over the hallway. A teenager of approximately 16 years was trying to convince the security guards to let her in. Please, I need to see her. I know she's here. I saw it on the internet. Frank approached, intrigued. The girl wore a public school uniform and carried a worn backpack. Can I help you? My name is Julia, she said, breathless. I just saw on social media about teacher Helen. She changed my life. Dr. Sanders intervened. At the moment, the patient cannot receive visitors. She's under intensive care. But you don't understand, insisted Julia, addressing Frank. Teacher Helen taught me to read when I was 8. No one believed in me. They said I had learning problems, but she never gave up. Frank saw a unique opportunity there. Julia, would you mind telling me more about this? In the hospital cafeteria, Julia revealed her story. With an old cell phone, she showed photos of a social literacy project where Helen worked voluntarily on Saturdays. In one of the images, a very different Helen, with well-groomed hair and a radiant smile, embraced a group of children. She would stay after class with those who had difficulties, Julia recounted, her eyes shining with memories. She brought books from home, invented games. When I managed to read my first text on my own, she cried with joy with me. As the girl spoke, Frank recorded her testimony with permission. He knew that this spontaneous testimony could be fundamental to the case. On the other side of the city, Richard was in his chambers, unable to concentrate on work. The anonymous letter disturbed him, but even more so the image of Helen fainting in the courtroom. His phone rang. It was Frank. Judge Mitchell, the lawyer's voice sounded grave. We need to talk. I have information that you need to know. Half an hour later, in a private room at the hospital, Richard listened attentively as Frank shared his discoveries. The lawyer had gained access to old courthouse records, which revealed something disturbing. 3 years earlier, Helen had tried to contact Richard. She came here, Frank explained, showing an internal occurrence record. She was barred at the entrance by a security guard who considered her suspicious. He didn't even register her attempt to make contact in the official system. Richard felt as if something broke inside him. For 3 years, Helen had been so close, trying to reach him while he continued his life protected by the walls of the institution. There's more, Frank continued, showing his phone. The video of Julia's testimony is already going viral on social media. The story is gaining proportions that we cannot control. Indeed, in the last few hours, the hashtag #WordJusticeForHelen had become a trending topic. People were sharing similar stories of how she had impacted their lives through education. A wave of indignation was growing against the system that had allowed a dedicated educator to end up on the streets. Richard, Frank said, using the judge's first name for the first time, you have 2 choices now. You can declare yourself disqualified, as the anonymous letter demands, or you can do the right thing. And what would be the right thing, asked Richard, although he already knew the answer. To publicly assume your connection to the case. Transform this story into a catalyst for real changes in the system. Helen is not just your ex-wife. She is the reflection of how our society treats its educators, its vulnerable ones. At that moment, a nurse hurriedly entered the room. Mr. Newman, your client is awake and she's asking for the judge. The hospital room was immersed in a soft twilight when Richard entered, followed by Frank. Helen was reclining in the bed, connected to tubes and monitors that emitted rhythmic beeps. Despite her apparent fragility, her eyes showed a lucidity, that they hadn't displayed for a long time. "Richard," she said, her voice just a whisper. "So it wasn't a dream. It really was you in that courtroom." The judge felt his legs weaken. He approached slowly, as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. "Helen, forgive me. For everything." Frank discreetly positioned himself near the door, giving them privacy, but remaining present as a legal guarantee of the situation. Outside the room, a small crowd was forming. Former students of Helen, parents of children she had helped, all mobilized by the story that had gone viral on social networks. "When did we lose ourselves so much?" asked Helen, her teary eyes fixed on her ex-husband. "You moved on, built your career. I tried to do the same, I continued teaching, helping whom I could, until my mother got sick." Richard pulled a chair close to the bed. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for hers. "Why didn't you seek me out before?" A sad smile formed on Helen's lips. "I tried. 3 years ago, when things started to fall apart. But the man at the courthouse entrance, and he laughed at me, said judges don't receive beggars." The revelation hit Richard like a punch. He remembered how many times he had passed through the courthouse entrance, superficially greeting the security guards, never imagining that one of them could have been the wall between him and Helen. "Things changed a lot after I left the apartment," she continued, her voice gradually gaining strength. "At first, I was still able to maintain some private lessons. I rented a small room near my mother's house. But when she got sick, you know how treatments are. Expensive, endless." Frank, who had maintained silence until then, approached. "Helen, with your permission, I'd like to record your testimony. It can help us change things." She nodded slowly. "You know what's most ironic? Even living on the streets, I never stopped teaching. There were other people like me, some who couldn't read. On cold nights while we protected ourselves under overpasses, I would draw letters in the dust, teach basic words. Education was the only thing that no one could take from me." As Helen spoke, the door to the room opened softly. Julia, the teenager who had appeared earlier, entered accompanied by Dr. Sanders. Upon seeing her former teacher, the girl couldn't contain her tears. "Teacher Helen," exclaimed Julia, running to gently embrace her. "Do you remember me? I'm Julia, from the Light of Knowledge project." Helen's face lit up with sudden recognition. "Julia, my little Julia. But you've grown so much." "I'm in my second year of high school now," said the girl proudly. "And you know what? I want to be a teacher just like you." The emotion of that moment was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Reporters were trying to enter the hospital, attracted by the story that was gaining ever larger proportions on social networks. The hashtag #TornJusticeForHelen was now accompanied by Frank's teachers of the streets, initiating a national debate about the devaluation of educators. Frank checked his phone, surprised by the repercussion. The case is gaining a dimension we didn't expect. People from all over the country are sharing similar stories. Richard, who had remained silent observing the reunion between Helen and her former student, made a decision. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and addressed Frank. "Prepare a press conference. It's time to assume my responsibilities, not just as a judge, but as a human being." Helen tried to get up, concerned. "Richard, your career—" "My career isn't worth more than your dignity," he interrupted. "It isn't worth more than the dignity of any human being who needs help." At that moment, Ms. Celia hurriedly entered the room carrying another envelope. "Judge Mitchell, this arrived for you. It's from the Judicial Council." The judge opened the envelope with steady hands, his face remaining impassive as he read the contents. Frank and Helen watched apprehensively, while Julia firmly held her former teacher's hand. The content of the letter from the Judicial Council made Richard momentarily pale. They weren't threats, as he had expected, but something much more surprising. A summons for an extraordinary meeting to discuss policies for access to justice for people in situations of social vulnerability. His case with Helen had reached the ears of the council in a completely different way than the anonymous letter had threatened. "They want to use our case as a starting point for a reform in the system," explained Richard, his voice mixing relief and surprise. "Apparently, I'm not the only judge who has encountered people they know on the other side of the courtroom." Frank smiled, understanding the implications of that change in perspective. "Sometimes we need an emblematic case to expose the flaws in the system. Helen, your story is doing more than we imagined." Outside the hospital, a small, peaceful demonstration was forming. Teachers, students, and social activists held signs with phrases of support for Helen and all educators in vulnerable situations. The local media covered the event, broadcasting live to the entire country. Dr. Sanders entered the room for another evaluation of Helen. "Your tests are improving," she announced with a smile, "but we still need to keep you under observation for a few days." "Doctor," interrupted Julia, who hadn't left her former teacher's side, "can I bring my books to read with her? Now I'm the one who can help her." The doctor nodded, moved by the proposal. It was a cycle coming full circle. The former student, now becoming a teacher to the one who had taught her to read. Helen observed everything with a mixture of gratitude and incredulity. In less than a week, her life had taken a complete turnaround. From invisible on the streets, she had become a symbol of a struggle greater than herself. "Richard," she called, her voice stronger than before, "I need you to understand something. I don't want you to feel guilty about what happened to me. Each of us made our choices, took our paths." The judge sat down again at her side, taking her hands in his. "But I could have done something. I should have looked for you, cared." "The past cannot be changed," she gently interrupted. "But the future is still in our hands, and not just in ours." Frank, who was observing the scene, realized it was time to act. Helen is right, and that's why we need to transform this story into something bigger. "Richard, that press conference. Are you ready for it?" The judge took a deep breath, looking through the hospital window at the crowd gathering below. He saw young and old faces, people from different social classes, all united by a cause that transcended Helen's story. "I'm ready," he responded, turning to face Frank. "But I don't just want to talk about the past. I want to propose concrete changes in the judicial system, care protocols for people in vulnerable situations, training programs for employees, partnerships with social projects, and education," added Helen, her voice gaining a tone of determination. "We cannot forget that everything begins with education. How many teachers are one health problem away from ending up on the streets? How many talents are we losing by not taking care of those who care for others?" Julia, who had remained quiet, listening to the adults' conversation, suddenly stood up. "Teacher, can I speak at the conference too? I want to tell how you changed my life, how you changed the lives of so many other students." At that moment, Miss Celia returned to the room, now accompanied by a social worker from the hospital. The professional carried a folder full of documents and a welcoming smile on her face. "Miss Fields," she began, "I've come to present some proposals for social reintegration programs and assisted housing. We have partnerships with institutions that can help you start over at your own pace and respecting your autonomy." The social worker's words provoked silent tears in Helen. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of hope. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like a frightening place. The main auditorium of the courthouse was packed for the press conference. Journalists from all over the country crowded, cameras strategically positioned, microphones pointed at the stage where a table had been prepared. Richard nervously adjusted his tie, while Frank organized the final details. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Frank, observing his friend with concern. "We can still find another way." Richard smiled serenely. "For the first time in a long time, I'm absolutely certain of what I need to do." The live broadcast had already begun when Richard took his place at the table. Beside him, an empty chair awaited Helen, who would participate via video conference directly from the hospital. In the front rows, Julia sat among other former students of Helen who had appeared to show support. "Good afternoon, everyone," Richard began, his firm voice echoing through the microphone. "We are here today to discuss not just a specific case, but a systemic failure in our society. a failure that I, as a representative of the judiciary, helped perpetuate through my silence and my omission. A murmur ran through the auditorium. On the side screens, Helen's image appeared, transmitted from the hospital room. She looked more vibrant, her hair carefully combed by the nursing staff. "The woman you see on this screen," continued Richard, "is not just another judicial case. She is Helen Fields, an educator who dedicated 15 years of her life to the formation of hundreds of young people. And she is also my ex-wife." The auditorium exploded in surprised exclamations. Flashes fired incessantly, while journalists leaned over their laptops, typing frantically. "But this is not a story about our marriage or our separation," he continued. "It's a story about how our society allows valuable people to fall into an abyss of invisibility. How our institutions, created to protect, can become insurmountable barriers for those who most need help." Helen, through the screen, took the floor. "For years, even living on the streets, I continued to exercise my vocation, because teaching is not just a profession, it's a mission. But how many other teachers are on the edge of the same precipice? How many have to choose between buying medicine or paying rent?" It was at this moment that Julia stood up, walking determinedly to the microphone. Her young voice trembled slightly, but her words came out clear and strong. "I was 8 years old when I met teacher Helen. Other teachers said I would never learn to read properly, but she believed in me. She stayed after class, invented games, brought books from home. Today, I'm the first in my family to reach high school." The cameras focused on the teenager's face, capturing the genuine emotion in her words. On social networks, the hashtag #ToonTeachers of the streets had transformed into a national movement, with thousands sharing similar stories. Frank seized the moment to present data his team had gathered. In the last 5 years, more than 3,000 teachers have lost their homes due to financial problems. The number of educators in situations of social vulnerability increased 200% after the pandemic. This is not just a statistic. These are lives, dreams, and potential being wasted. Richard then revealed the content of the letter from the Judicial Council. Starting this week, a pilot program of specialized care for people in vulnerable situations will be implemented. All judiciary employees will receive specific training for proper reception and referral, but this is just the beginning. Helen, through the screen, smiled emotionally. "I don't want my story to be seen as an individual drama. I want it to be a starting point for real changes. Each person on the streets has a story, has value, has potential. We need to create bridges, not walls." At the back of the auditorium, Ms. Celia discreetly wiped away tears while holding a new stack of letters. They were messages of support, arriving from all over the country, from judges, prosecutors, and lawyers who had also encountered similar stories in their courts. The press conference extended for more than 2 hours, with questions that went far beyond Helen's specific case. Public policies, reforms in the judicial system, support programs for educators, and mainly the need to humanize institutions were discussed. When the last journalist left the auditorium, Richard remained seated, looking at the screen where Helen's image still smiled. Something had definitely changed that day, not just in their personal lives, but in the very fabric of society. A week after the press conference, Helen was transferred to a specialized shelter house, maintained by an NGO partner of the Social Reintegration Program. The place, a renovated old mansion in the Botanical Garden neighborhood, offered not just shelter, but also psychological support and preparation for returning to professional life. In her new room, very different from the hospital environment, Helen carefully organized a small collection of books that Julia had brought her. They were basic literacy works, illustrated dictionaries, and some classics of American literature. Her hands caressed the covers with reverence, as if touching old friends long lost. "They kept everything exactly as you left it," said Julia, entering the room with a few more books in her arms. The teenager had become a constant presence in Helen's life, visiting her whenever possible after school. "It's strange to have my own space again," responded Helen, adjusting a photo frame on the bedside table. In the photo, she and her former students from the Light of Knowledge project smiled at the camera, Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, scared, thinking I'm still on the streets. The psychologist at the shelter, Dr. Marina, had explained that this feeling was normal. The trauma of life on the streets didn't disappear overnight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of inner work to rebuild not just practical life, but also confidence and self-esteem. That afternoon, Frank arrived for a visit, bringing important news. The State Board of Education reached out, he announced, sitting in the armchair by the window. They want you to participate in a pilot project for reintegration of teachers who have been away. Helen stopped organizing the books, turning to face him. What do you mean? It's a new program, inspired by the repercussion of your case. They're going to offer pedagogical updates, psychological support, and gradual reinsertion into the classroom for teachers who had to take time off due to health issues or financial difficulties. A shy smile illuminated Helen's face. The idea of returning to teaching, even if gradually, made her heart race with anticipation. And there's more, continued Frank, taking an envelope from his briefcase. Remember that security guard who barred you at the courthouse 3 years ago? He wrote an apology letter. He's participating in the new training program and wants to share his story as an example of what not to do. Julia, who was listening to everything attentively, couldn't contain her excitement. Teacher, does this mean you'll be able to teach again? Because there's an after-school tutoring project at my school, and I thought... Helen laughed, embracing her former student. Calm down, little one. One step at a time, remember. Like you always told me when you were learning to read. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Richard's arrival. Since the press conference, he had been visiting Helen regularly, always respecting her space and her recovery process. He carried with him an old yellowed folder. I found this at the bottom of a drawer, he said, handing the folder to Helen. They're your old projects, those you developed when you taught in the outskirts. I thought it might help with the new program. Helen opened the folder carefully, recognizing her own handwriting in notes from years ago. Lesson plans, reading projects, ideas for cultural workshops, a whole universe of possibilities that had been interrupted, but that now could gain new life. You know what's most incredible? Commented Frank, observing the scene. All of this began with a cold night and a search for shelter. Sometimes we need to hit rock bottom for people to look down and realize how many treasures are buried. Richard remained silent, watching. Helen leafed through her old projects with Julia. They were no longer husband and wife nor judge and defendant. They were two people who, through painful paths, had rediscovered the value of empathy and solidarity. In the garden of the shelter, other women in the process of social reintegration cultivated a small vegetable garden. The project, started a few days ago, already showed its first green shoots breaking through the soil. Like those plants, Helen was also reborn, not to return to what she was before, but to become something new, stronger, and more aware of her own value. The auditorium of Paulo Freire Public School was full of teachers, students, and family members that Saturday morning. A colorful banner announced the launch of the Resilient Educators program, an initiative born from the repercussion of Helen's case. On the stage, a simple table awaited the day's speakers. Helen adjusted the navy blue blazer that Julia had helped her choose. They were new clothes bought with her first salary as a consultant for the program. Her hair, now well cared for, framed a face that was beginning to show the serenity of other times. Are you nervous? Asked Dr. Marina, who accompanied her as emotional support in this important moment. A little, admitted Helen, but it's a good nervousness, like the one I used to feel before the first day of class, you know. The Resilient Educators program had been structured over the last 2 months, bringing together different institutions in a joint effort. The idea was to create a support network for teachers in vulnerable situations, offering financial aid, psychological support, and professional placement opportunities. Frank took the stage to open the event. 3 months ago, a story made us question the values of our society. Today, that same story brings us together to transform questions into concrete actions. In the front row, Richard observed everything with a mixture of pride and reflection. Beside him, Ms. Celia held a folder with dozens of registration forms, teachers from all over the state who had registered to receive support from the program. Helen stood up when it was her turn to speak. She walked to the microphone with firm steps, different from those hesitant ones months ago in the courtroom. "When we live on the streets," she began, her voice clear and emotional, "we learn to become invisible. It's a survival mechanism. But we also learn that there are lights that not even the deepest helplessness can extinguish. For me, that light was always education." Helen's words echoed through the auditorium as images were projected on the screen behind her. Photos of the Light of Knowledge project, records of her volunteer work, smiling faces of students she had helped over the years. "This program is not about charity," she continued. "It's about recognition. Recognition that each educator carries within them a transformative potential that cannot be wasted. It's about creating bridges where there were only abysses before." Julia, who now integrated the youth committee of the program, stood up to present her part. "We created an app where teachers can seek help anonymously. It has an emergency button for urgent cases and a network of volunteer professionals always available." The audience applauded enthusiastically when the teenager demonstrated how the app worked. On the cell phone screen, projected on the big screen, a simple and welcoming interface was visible with different support channels: psychological, legal, financial, and pedagogical. "But the most important thing," Helen resumed, "is that we are not just offering emergency assistance. We are building a new way of seeing and valuing our educators." At the back of the auditorium, a group of people attracted attention. They were homeless people whom Helen had specially invited to the event. Among them, some were teachers, others artists, liberal professionals, people who, like her, had been lost in the traps of social vulnerability. "Starting today," announced Frank, returning to the microphone, "the program is officially functioning, and we already have our first victory to share." Helen smiled, knowing what would come next. A lady of about 60 years old stood up timidly in the audience. It was Margaret, a retired math teacher who had lost her home after a series of health problems. "Thanks to the program," explained Frank, "Margaret is returning to the classroom as a tutor in the school reinforcement project. Additionally, through our partnership with the housing department, she will receive an apartment in the assisted housing program." Applause echoed through the auditorium as Margaret was invited to come up to the stage. Her teary eyes reflected an emotion that words could not express. Richard observed everything with a lump in his throat. He remembered when he first saw Helen in that courtroom and how that moment had triggered a series of transformations that went far beyond their personal lives. During the intermission of the event, as people gathered for coffee, Helen was approached by various teachers who wanted to share their stories. Each account confirmed the importance of the program and the urgency of its actions. "You know what moves me the most?" she commented to Dr. Marina. "Seeing that cold night when I sought shelter at the restaurant wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger." The small apartment in Hope Village residential complex no longer seemed so empty. On the walls, colorful posters with motivational phrases and student work gave life to the environment. Helen was finishing organizing materials for her first official class in the Adult Literacy Project, an initiative that had been born as an offshoot of the Resilient Educators program. "Are you sure you don't want help?" asked Julia, who had spent the afternoon helping to organize the space. The teenager had become not just a constant friend, but a true partner in educational projects. "I think I need to do this alone," responded Helen, smiling as she arranged the final details. "It's like a ritual of beginning again." The apartment was part of the assisted housing program, a partnership between the judiciary and the City Hall. It was a modest but welcoming space, located in a housing complex that sheltered other beneficiaries of the project. There, Helen was not just a resident, but also a mentor for other teachers in the process of recovery. A soft knock on the door announced Frank's arrival. The lawyer, who had become a close friend, brought with him a surprise: the official approval from the Department of Education to expand the Resilient Educators program at a national level. "It's official," he announced, showing the documents. "Starting next semester, we'll have program centers in 5 states. Your case, Helen, opened the eyes of many important people." Helen sat down for a moment, absorbing the news. "Sometimes I wonder if all this is real. It seems like just yesterday I was sleeping between cardboard boxes." "And look at you now," smiled Julia, pointing to the class schedule fixed on the wall. "Tomorrow, your first official class begins." The adult literacy project was especially significant for Helen. Many of her students would be people in situations of social vulnerability, including some who, like her, had experienced life on the streets. The difference was that now there was a support network, an integrated system of assistance that went beyond education. Richard arrived shortly after, bringing a small pot of violets. Since the beginning of the program, he had remained present in Helen's life, but always respecting the boundaries she had established. They were no longer a couple, but they had found a mature form of friendship and partnership. "Violets were your mother's favorites," he said, placing the pot on the windowsill. "I thought it would be a good charm for the new beginning." Helen touched the purple petals delicately, remembering her mother and how she always said that violets were resilient flowers, capable of blooming even in the most unlikely environments. "I have news," announced Richard after a moment. "The National Council of Justice approved a resolution making the reception protocol we created mandatory. Now all courts in the country will have to implement specific measures for attending to people in vulnerable situations." The news was received with emotional smiles. It was another confirmation that Helen's story had transformed into a catalyst for real and lasting changes. Dr. Marina, who had arrived for a follow-up visit, observed the scene with professional satisfaction. Helen's progress was remarkable, not just in practical terms, but mainly in her emotional recovery. "You know what impresses me most about you, Helen," commented the psychologist. "Your ability to transform pain into purpose. You haven't just recovered, you're helping others recover too." As they conversed, the afternoon sun entered through the window, creating a play of light and shadow in the small apartment. On the living room table, the lesson plans for the next day were meticulously organized. On the walls, besides the posters, there was now a mural with photos. Some old ones from the time of the Light of Knowledge project, others recent, showing moments of the Resilient Educators program. "Tomorrow is a big day," said Helen, looking at her gathered friends. "But today is a day of gratitude. Gratitude for having found people who didn't let me give up, who helped me rebuild not just my life, but also my purpose." Julia approached with a small package in her hands. "It's a gift from my class. We opened a collection among the students." Helen unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a new book on literacy methodologies. On the first page, a collective dedication expressed the affection and admiration of her future professional colleagues. "The circle is complete," murmured Frank, observing the scene. "The student you taught to read is now helping you return to teaching." The sound of laughter and conversations filled the apartment, mixing with the noise of the city outside. It was a sound of life, of beginning again, of hope. Helen looked out the window at the sky that was beginning to take on the orange hues of sunset. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new chapter, and this time she was not alone. The small apartment in Hope Village residential complex no longer seemed so empty. On the walls, colorful posters with motivational phrases and student work gave life to the environment. Helen was finishing organizing materials for her first official class in the Adult Literacy Project, an initiative that had been born as an offshoot of the Resilient Educators program. "Are you sure you don't want help?" asked Julia, who had spent the afternoon helping to organize the space. The teenager had become not just a constant friend, but a true partner in educational projects. "I think I need to do this alone," responded Helen, smiling as she arranged the final details. "It's like a ritual of beginning again." The apartment was part of the Assisted Housing Program, a partnership between the judiciary and the City Hall. It was a modest but welcoming space located in a housing complex that sheltered other beneficiaries of the project. There, Helen was not just a resident, but also a mentor for other teachers in the process of recovery. A soft knock on the door announced Frank's arrival. The lawyer, who had become a close friend, brought with him a surprise: the official approval from the Department of Education to expand the Resilient Educators program at a national level. "It's official," he announced, showing the documents. "Starting next semester, we'll have program centers in 5 states. Your case, Helen, opened the eyes of many important people." Helen sat down for a moment, absorbing the news. "Sometimes I wonder if all this is real. It seems like just yesterday I was sleeping between cardboard boxes. And look at you now," smiled Julia, pointing to the class schedule fixed on the wall. "Tomorrow, your first official class begins." The Adult Literacy Project was especially significant for Helen. Many of her students would be people in situations of social vulnerability, including some who, like her, had experienced life on the streets. The difference was that now there was a support network, an integrated system of assistance that went beyond education. Richard arrived shortly after, bringing a small pot of violets. Since the beginning of the program, he had remained present in Helen's life, but always respecting the boundaries she had established. They were no longer a couple, but they had found a mature form of friendship and partnership. "Violets were your mother's favorites," he said, placing the pot on the windowsill. "I thought it would be a good charm for the new beginning." Helen touched the purple petals delicately, remembering her mother and how she always said that violets were resilient flowers, capable of blooming even in the most unlikely environments. "I have news," announced Richard after a moment. "The National Council of Justice approved a resolution making the reception protocol we created mandatory. Now all courts in the country will have to implement specific measures for attending to people in vulnerable situations." The news was received with emotional smiles. It was another confirmation that Helen's story had transformed into a catalyst for real and lasting changes. Dr. Marina, who had arrived for a follow-up visit, observed the scene with professional satisfaction. Helen's progress was remarkable, not just in practical terms, but mainly in her emotional recovery. "You know what impresses me most about you, Helen," commented the psychologist. "Your ability to transform pain into purpose. You haven't just recovered, you're helping others recover too." As they conversed, the afternoon sun entered through the window, creating a play of light and shadow in the small apartment. On the living room table, the lesson plans for the next day were meticulously organized. On the walls, besides the posters, there was now a mural with photos, some old ones from the time of the Light of Knowledge project, others recent, showing moments of the Resilient Educators program. "Tomorrow is a big day," said Helen, looking at her gathered friends. "But today is a day of gratitude. Gratitude for having found people who didn't let me give up, who helped me rebuild not just my life, but also my purpose." Julia approached with a small package in her hands. "It's a gift from my class. We opened a collection among the students." Helen unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a new book on literacy methodologies. On the first page, a collective dedication expressed the affection and admiration of her future professional colleagues. "The circle is complete," murmured Frank, observing the scene. "The student you taught to read is now helping you return to teaching." The sound of laughter and conversations filled the apartment, mixing with the noise of the city outside. It was a sound of life, of beginning again, of hope. Helen looked out the window at the sky that was beginning to take on the orange hues of sunset. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new chapter, and this time, she was not alone. The university auditorium was packed for the first National Symposium on Education and Social Inclusion. Educators, researchers, and activists from across the country had gathered to discuss the preliminary results of the Resilient Educators program and its ramifications. In the front row, Helen nervously adjusted the papers for her presentation. "Take a deep breath," whispered Julia, now a freshman in the education program, seated beside her. "You've faced much more difficult things than this." The event marked a significant moment. 6 months had passed since the official start of the program, and the results exceeded all expectations. More than 200 teachers had been directly benefited, and the model was being adapted for other professional categories. "And now," announced the moderator, Professor Helen Fields, Pedagogical Coordinator of the Resilient Educators Program. Helen rose, feeling the weight of gazes upon her. She was no longer the fragile woman from the courtroom, nor the teacher who had lost everything. She was a woman who had transformed her pain into purpose, her scars into bridges to help others. "When we talk about education," she began, her firm voice echoing through the auditorium, "we generally think of classrooms, textbooks, tests, and grades. But true education happens in encounters, in transformations, in the ability to see the other as a complete human being with their history and dreams." In the audience, attentive faces absorbed every word. Among them was Peter, the former geography teacher, who now coordinated one of the program's centers. Beside him, Margaret smiled, proud to see her friend on stage. "In the last 6 months," Helen continued, "we haven't just rescued teachers from vulnerable situations. We've created a new way of understanding education as a tool for social transformation. Each educator recovered means dozens of lives positively impacted." The images on the screen showed impressive numbers: a 70% reduction in cases of professional abandonment among program participants, significant improvement in mental health indicators, successful reintegration of 85% of beneficiaries into the workforce. "But beyond the numbers," she continued, "there are the stories, like that of Maria Jones, who at 62 learned to read and now coordinates a reading group for other women in her community. Or the story of Professor Charles, who after 3 years living on the streets, now teaches mathematics in a social project. Richard, sitting discreetly at the back of the auditorium, felt his heart swell with pride. As a judge, he was accustomed to seeing social problems through the cold lens of the law. Now, thanks to Helen, he had learned to see the possibilities for transformation in each case that came to his court. Frank, who would soon present the legal aspects of the program, was preparing to announce important news: the approval of a state law guaranteeing specific support for education professionals in vulnerable situations. "The most important thing," Helen continued, reaching the final part of her presentation, "is that we are breaking the cycle of silence and invisibility. Each rescued teacher becomes an agent of transformation, creating a multiplier effect that benefits the whole society." Dr. Marina, who coordinated the program's mental health team, took enthusiastic notes. The results of the group therapies had exceeded all expectations, creating an innovative methodology that was already being studied by other institutions. "Today," said Helen, her voice choked with emotion, "I am not here just as the program coordinator. I am here as a living witness that it is possible to rebuild lives through education and solidarity." On the screen appeared an image that moved everyone: a recent photo of the shelter house garden, where teachers and students shared an outdoor reading circle. Among them, smiling faces showed regained dignity. "Each of us," Helen concluded, "carries a story of struggle and overcoming. But when these stories meet, when we create networks of support and understanding, we transform not just individual lives, but the entire social structure." The audience rose in an emotional ovation. Amid applause and tears, educators embraced, recognizing in their own trajectories the echoes of Helen's story. Julia, who couldn't contain her tears, hugged her mentor as soon as she left the stage. "You did it, teacher. You showed everyone that there's always a way." During the intermission that followed, the auditorium lobby transformed into a space of intense exchanges. Teachers shared experiences, researchers discussed methodologies, activists planned new actions. It was as if a wave of hope and possibilities had been unleashed. The university auditorium was packed for the first national symposium on education and social inclusion. Educators, researchers, and activists from across the country had gathered to discuss the preliminary results of the Resilient Educators program and its ramifications. In the front row, Helen nervously adjusted the papers for her presentation. "Take a deep breath," whispered Julia, now a freshman in the education program, seated beside her. "You've faced much more difficult things than this." The event marked a significant moment. 6 months had passed since the official start of the program, and the results exceeded all expectations. More than 200 teachers had been directly benefited, and the model was being adapted for other professional categories. And now, announced the moderator, Professor Helen Fields, pedagogical coordinator of the Resilient Educators program. Helen rose, feeling the weight of gazes upon her. She was no longer the fragile woman from the courtroom, nor the teacher who had lost everything. She was a woman who had transformed her pain into purpose, her scars into bridges to help others. "When we talk about education," she began, her firm voice echoing through the auditorium, "we generally think of classrooms, textbooks, tests, and grades. But true education happens in encounters, in transformations, in the ability to see the other as a complete human being with their history and dreams." In the audience, attentive faces absorbed every word. Among them was Peter, the former geography teacher, who now coordinated one of the program's centers. Beside him, Margaret smiled, proud to see her friend on stage. "In the last 6 months," Helen continued, "we haven't just rescued teachers from vulnerable situations. We've created a new way of understanding education as a tool for social transformation. Each educator recovered means dozens of lives positively impacted." The images on the screen showed impressive numbers: a 70% reduction in cases of professional abandonment among program participants, significant improvement in mental health indicators, successful reintegration of 85% of beneficiaries into the EE workforce. "But beyond the numbers," she continued, "there are the stories, like that of Maria Jones, who at 62 learned to read and now coordinates a reading group for other women in her community, or the story of Professor Charles, who after 3 years living on the streets, now teaches mathematics in a social project." Richard, sitting discreetly at the back of the auditorium, felt his heart swell with pride. As a judge, he was accustomed to seeing social problems through the cold lens of the law. Now, thanks to Helen, he had learned to see the possibilities for transformation in each case that came to his court. Frank, who would soon present the legal aspects of the program, was preparing to announce important news: the approval of a state law guaranteeing specific support for education professionals in vulnerable situations. "The most important thing," Helen continued, reaching the final part of her presentation, "is that we are breaking the cycle of silence and invisibility. Each rescued teacher becomes an agent of transformation, creating a multiplier effect that benefits the whole society." Dr. Marina, who coordinated the program's mental health team, took enthusiastic notes. The results of the group therapies had exceeded all expectations, creating an innovative methodology that was already being studied by other institutions. "Today," said Helen, her voice choked with emotion, "I am not here just as the program coordinator. I am here as a living witness that it is possible to rebuild lives through education and solidarity." On the screen appeared an image that moved everyone: a recent photo of the shelter house garden, where teachers and students shared an outdoor reading circle. Among them, smiling faces showed regained dignity. "Each of us," Helen concluded, "carries a story of struggle and overcoming. But when these stories meet, when we create networks of support and understanding, we transform not just individual lives, but the entire social structure." The audience rose in an emotional ovation. Amid applause and tears, educators embraced, recognizing in their own trajectories the echoes of Helen's story. Julia, who couldn't contain her tears, hugged her mentor as soon as she left the stage. "You did it, teacher. You showed everyone that there's always a way." During the intermission that followed, the auditorium lobby transformed into a space of intense exchanges. Teachers shared experiences, researchers discussed methodologies, activists planned new actions. It was as if a wave of hope and possibilities had been unleashed. In the library of the shelter house, now transformed into a vibrant cultural space, Helen organized the final details for the launch of the book, Resilient Educators: Stories of New Beginnings. The work, collectively organized, gathered testimonials, experiences, and methodologies developed throughout the program's first year. "I still can't believe we did it," said Julia, helping to arrange the chairs for the event. The young education student had contributed significantly to the book, coordinating the interviews and helping organize the texts. The space was decorated with photographs that told the program's story, from that first tense hearing to the most recent moments of celebration and achievement. In each image, faces that had gone from invisible to protagonists of their own stories. Helen, called Dr. Beth, entering the library with an envelope in her hands. The final report on the research about the program's impact on participants' mental health has arrived. The results are impressive. The study, conducted in partnership with 3 universities, demonstrated a significant reduction in cases of depression and anxiety among the teachers participating in the program. More than that, it showed how the sense of purpose and belonging had been fundamental for recovery. Richard arrived shortly after, accompanied by a surprise, representatives from the Department of Education who had come to personally learn about the program. The project had caught the attention of the federal government, which was studying implementing it on a national scale. "It's surreal to think that it all started on that cold night," commented Frank, observing the movement of people beginning to arrive for the launch. "How a search for shelter can trigger so many transformations." Helen smiled, recalling her journey. "Sometimes we need to completely lose ourselves to find a new path, and more importantly, to help others find theirs." The room began to fill. Among those present were several protagonists of the stories told in the book. Maria Jones, now literate, proudly read excerpts of her own testimony to whoever wanted to listen. Peter, recovered and teaching again, had brought his new students to honor the event. "Teacher Helen," called a familiar voice. It was one of the courthouse security guards, the same one who had prevented her from entering years before. "I came to apologize personally and thank you. The training I received through the program completely changed how I see people." The most emotional moment of the night was when Julia took the small, improvised stage to make a special presentation. With the help of other education students, she had prepared a presentation about the program's impact on new generations of educators. "Teacher Helen's story," she said, her voice firm and emotional, "taught us that being a teacher goes far beyond transmitting knowledge. It's about resistance, it's about hope, it's about never giving up on believing in the transformative power of education." In the audience, Dr. Marina observed with professional satisfaction how her patients had evolved. Many of those who before could barely talk about their traumas now became spokespersons for their own stories of overcoming. Helen, seated between Richard and Frank, felt a deep peace. It wasn't the end of a journey, but the beginning of many others. The program continued growing, transforming, reaching more lives. "You know what moves me the most?" she commented to her friends. "Seeing how each person who goes through the program takes with them not just help, but also the capacity to help others." Richard nodded, deeply understanding the meaning of those words. As a judge, he had learned that true justice wasn't just in the laws, but in the ability to recognize the humanity in each person who passed through his courtroom. The event extended into the night, with people sharing stories, exchanging experiences, weaving new dreams. In the library, now full of life and hope, each book on the shelves seemed to whisper possibilities of transformation. At the end of the night, when most of the guests had already left, Helen remained alone for a moment in the library. She touched the pages of the newly launched book, feeling under her fingers not just paper and ink, but the living record of so many stories of overcoming. Through the window, she could see the garden of the shelter house, where the flowers planted months ago now bloomed in abundance. Like those plants, each person who passed through the program found their own time and way to bloom. Helen's small apartment had become an informal meeting point for program participants. That Saturday afternoon, as a gentle rain fell outside, a special group gathered to celebrate an important achievement: Julia's graduation from her first semester of education. "I can't believe a year and a half has already passed," commented the young woman, admiring the cake, decorated with miniature sugar replicas of books. "It seems like it was yesterday that I was trying to convince the hospital security guards to let me see you, teacher." Helen smiled, remembering that crucial day. "And now you're here, following your own steps as an educator. Life has these wonderful surprises." The room was decorated with flowers and balloons, and a banner made by the Literacy Project students congratulated Julia. Among those present was Maria Jones, who now coordinated a reading group for seniors, and Peter, who had fully resumed his career as a geography teacher. "I have news to share," announced Frank, who had just arrived with a folder of documents. The Resilient Educators program has been selected as a model public policy by UNESCO. They're going to implement it in other Latin American countries. The news was received with enthusiasm by everyone. What had begun as a story of personal redemption had transformed into an international movement of social transformation through education. "And there's more," he continued, pulling a newspaper from the folder. "It was published on the front page today. The rate of teachers in situations of social vulnerability has fallen 45% in regions where the program was implemented." Richard, who observed the scene leaning against the doorframe, felt a wave of pride. As a judge, he was accustomed to dealing with statistics and numbers, but now he clearly saw the faces and stories behind that data. "Helen," called Dr. Marina, who had arrived discreetly, "I need to tell you something important. Remember that research we were doing on the program's impact on participants' mental health? It's been approved for international publication." The study, conducted over a year, demonstrated how the program's comprehensive approach, combining housing, work, therapy, and social reconnection, had created an innovative model of recovery and social reintegration. "But the most interesting thing," continued the psychologist, "is that we identified a pattern we call the multiplier effect of empathy. Each person who goes through the program ends up becoming an agent of transformation in their community." Julia, who was listening attentively, stood up with her juice glass. "That's exactly what I want to address in my research project. How a single story of overcoming can trigger waves of change throughout an entire society." The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. It was an elegant, grey-haired lady with a sweet gaze, the former principal of the school where Helen had begun her career as a teacher. "Mrs. Connie," exclaimed Helen, running to embrace her former mentor. "How did you know?" "Julia found me," smiled the lady, "and I couldn't miss coming. I always knew you had something special, Helen, something that went beyond the gift of teaching. You have the gift of transforming lives." The presence of Mrs. Connie brought up memories of the beginning of Helen's career, of her first dreams. As an educator, it was as if a circle was closing, uniting past and present in a narrative of overcoming and hope. "I brought something for you," said the former principal, handing a yellowed envelope to Helen. "I kept it all these years. They're the drawings and letters your first students made, remember? That special class from the reading project." Helen opened the envelope with trembling hands, and dozens of colorful drawings and children's letters spread across the table. Each paper told a story of transformation, of small victories that had planted the seeds of what she would become. "Look," pointed Julia, picking up one of the drawings. "This could be me, a girl learning to read, with a huge smile on her face." The group gathered around the table, sharing stories and memories. Each person there represented a different chapter in Helen's journey, from rock bottom to rebuilding, from loneliness to belonging, from despair to hope. "You know what moves me the most?" said Helen, looking at that unlikely group gathered in her living room. "Seeing how each one of you took a little piece of this story and transformed it into something even bigger." The rain outside had given way to a golden late afternoon. Through the apartment window, one could see the community garden where the residents of the shelter house cultivated not only flowers but also dreams and possibilities. "And this is just the beginning," smiled Julia, embracing her mentor. "We still have so many stories to write, so many lives to transform." The Resilient Educators Cultural Center, inaugurated on that sunny morning, was much more than a renovated building in the heart of the city. It represented the materialization of a collective dream, a space where stories of overcoming were transformed into tools for social change. Helen walked through the corridors of the new center, observing the photographs that told the program's story. In each image, a different chapter of this extraordinary journey. The first literacy class, Julia's graduation, the book launch, the gatherings in the shelter house garden. "It's amazing how everything has transformed," commented Frank, who accompanied her on the final inspection before the inauguration ceremony. "Remember when we met in that courtroom?" Helen smiled, stopping before a particularly significant photo. She and her literacy project students, all smiling, holding their first books. "Each moment, even the most difficult ones, brought us here." The cultural center had been designed as a multifunctional space. On the ground floor, a community library and classrooms for educational projects. On the first floor, offices for psychological and legal assistance. On the second, an auditorium for events and a coexistence space. And on the roof, a suspended garden where program participants could cultivate not only plants, but also dreams. "Helen," called Julia, hurriedly climbing the stairs. "The first guests are already arriving and there's a special surprise waiting for you at the entrance." Upon reaching the main hall, Helen found a group she hadn't seen for a long time. Her former students from the Light of Knowledge project, now adults, many of them teachers. They had organized a special tribute, a documentary video gathering testimonials from people impacted by her work over the years. "Teacher," said one of them, a young man who now taught mathematics, "you taught us much more than letters and numbers. You taught us never to give up on our dreams." Richard, who had arrived discreetly, observed the scene with emotion. As a judge, he had learned that true justice wasn't just in codes and laws, but in the ability to recognize and restore human dignity. "I have an important announcement," he said, approaching the group. "The National Council of Justice has just approved a resolution making the implementation of programs similar to Resilient Educators mandatory in all courts across the country." The news was received with emotional applause. Dr. Marina, who now coordinated a team of psychologists specialized in social trauma, explained the practical significance of that decision. "This means that more people will have access to a truly humanized justice system." The center began to fill with guests of all kinds: teachers, students, judicial professionals, volunteers, shelter house residents. Each person there carried a story of transformation, a part of this mosaic of overcoming and hope. Margaret, now the principal of a public school, brought a class of students to present a choir. The children sang a song specially composed for the occasion, speaking of new beginnings and second chances. "Helen," called Frank, indicating it was time for her inauguration speech. "Everyone is waiting." Climbing to the small stage set up in the hall, Helen felt the weight of all the stories that intertwined at that moment. She looked at the smiling faces watching her. Julia, now a promising educator. Richard, who had transformed his own vision of justice. Frank, who had made so many new beginnings possible. "This center," she began, her voice clear and emotional, "is not just a building. It's a symbol of how love, education, and solidarity can transform realities. Each room, each corridor, each space here was designed to welcome dreams and cultivate hopes." In the front row, Maria Jones proudly held her first book of poetry, written after learning to read. Beside her, Peter smiled, fully recovered and once again passionate about the teaching profession. 2 years ago, I was lost on the streets, invisible to society's eyes. Today, we are all here, celebrating not just my story, but the story of each person who found in this program a chance to start over. Helen's words echoed through the hall, touching hearts and provoking reflections. It wasn't just an inauguration speech, but a living testimony of how education can be a powerful tool for social transformation. This center, she concluded, is dedicated to all those still out there looking for their way back. To all who, even in the most difficult circumstances, keep alive the flame of hope. Because each story of overcoming is a seed in the wind, capable of blooming in the most unlikely places. The meeting room of the Cultural Center was buzzing with energy that morning. Representatives from 5 Latin American countries had arrived to learn firsthand about the Resilient Educators program and plan its implementation in their respective nations. Helen, seated at the head of the table, was still surprised by the dimension her project had reached. "It's impressive how you managed to integrate social assistance, education, and the judicial system, commented Maria Gonzalez, educational coordinator from Chile. In our country, we have many teachers facing similar situations. Julia, now a trained educator and integral part of the coordination team, presented the program's most recent data. In the last 2 years, we've assisted more than 1,000 teachers in vulnerable situations. Of these, 87% have returned to the classroom or found new ways to work in education. Frank, who had just arrived from a meeting at the Supreme Court, brought encouraging news. The program has been included as a permanent public policy in the federal budget. We will no longer depend solely on partnerships and donations. The Aisin news was received with enthusiasm by those present. It was the guarantee of continuity that the project needed to expand even further. Richard, who participated as a legal consultant, explained the legal implications of the decision. This means that each state will be required to implement program centers, he clarified, and most importantly, with complete multidisciplinary teams. Helen observed the discussion with a mixture of pride and humility. In a corner of the room, a mural displayed photographs of the program's first beneficiaries, among them her own photo, from the time she lived on the streets, contrasted with recent images of her classes in the literacy project. Teacher, called Peter, who now coordinated the Professional Reintegration Center, the results of the latest social impact research have arrived. It's even better than we expected. The study, conducted by 3 universities in partnership, demonstrated how the program had created a cascade effect of positive transformations. Each recovered teacher directly impacted the lives of dozens of students who in turn transformed their own communities. But the most significant data, continued Peter, projecting a graph on the screen, is the change in social perception about teachers in vulnerable situations. The stigma is decreasing, and more people are volunteering to help. Dr. Marina, who now coordinated a national network of psychologists specialized in social trauma, presented her own discovery. We've developed a new care protocol based on the program's experiences. It's being adopted internationally. The meeting was briefly interrupted by a special arrival. Maria Jones, accompanied by a group of her elderly students, came to present the first book produced by her reading club, a collection of life stories written by people who, like her, had discovered the power of the written word late in life. Look at this, she smiled, distributing copies of the book. Who would have thought that I, who couldn't even sign my name 2 years ago, would be a writer today? Helen leafed through the book emotionally, recognizing in the stories told there the same elements of overcoming and hope that had marked her own journey. Each page was a living testimony of how education could transform realities. And there's one more surprise, announced Julia, barely containing her excitement. The university approved the creation of a specialization course in education and social inclusion based on the program's methodology. I'm going to be one of the professors. The news provoked a new wave of enthusiasm in the room. It was one more step in the institutionalization and perpetuation of the work developed. The planted seeds continued to germinate, producing new fruits. You know what moves me the most, commented Helen, observing that diverse group gathered around a common purpose. Seeing how a story of pain can transform into a source of hope for so many people. Richard, who observed her discreetly, noticed how she had blossomed. She was no longer the fragile woman he had found in that courtroom, nor just the dedicated teacher he had known in the past. She was a leader, a visionary, who had transformed her own tragedy into a movement for social change. And to think that it all started with a no, reflected Frank, referring to the security guard who had barred Helen at the courthouse years ago. Sometimes obstacles are just detours that lead us to more important paths. The afternoon advanced, and the meeting participants began to organize themselves into working groups, planning the implementation of the program in their countries. On the wall of the room, a large map showed luminous points where Resilient Educators was already operating and potential points for expansion. It's like a constellation, observed Maria Gonzalez, each point of light connected to others, forming a network of transformation and hope. The suspended garden of the cultural center was especially beautiful that night, Delicate lights hung among the plants, creating a magical atmosphere for the celebration of the second anniversary of the Resilient Educators program. The space, once empty, now overflowed with life and stories of overcoming. Helen walked among the guests, stopping here and there to listen to stories, share smiles, exchange hugs. Each person there represented a different chapter of this extraordinary journey that had begun on a cold night when she was merely seeking shelter. "Teacher," called a familiar voice. It was Carlos, one of the program's first beneficiaries, now a coordinator of a center in another state. "I brought someone special to meet you." Beside him was a lady of about 70, his former elementary school. "Teacher." "Miss Helen," said the lady emotionally, "when I saw your story on television, I had to come thank you. You are fulfilling the dream that many of us had, creating a protection network for educators." The conversation was interrupted by Julia, who climbed onto the small stage set up among the flowers. "Attention, everyone. We have a special announcement to make." The young educator, now coordinator of the training program for new multipliers, radiated happiness. Beside her, Dr. Marina and Frank, prepared to share the project's latest achievements. The Resilient Educators program has been selected to receive the International Social Innovation Award, announced Julia. But more important than that, the methodology we've developed will be implemented in 15 more countries over the next 2 years. Enthusiastic applause echoed through the garden. Among those present, various international representatives smiled, knowing that soon they would take that light to their own nations. Richard, who observed the scene leaning against a column, felt his heart warm. As a judge, he had learned that sometimes the greatest transformations began in the most unlikely places, like a courtroom on a seemingly ordinary morning. "It's incredible how everything connects, isn't it?" he commented, approaching Helen. "Each decision, each encounter, each moment brought us here." Helen smiled, observing the garden full of people who, like her, had found a new path through education and solidarity. "You know what I've learned in these 2 years, Richard? That our greatest fragilities can transform into our greatest strength." Maria Jones, now a published writer, coordinated a reading circle in a corner of the garden. Her students, all elderly, people who had learned to read late in life, shared stories and dreams with the same joy as children discovering the world. Peter, recovered and fulfilled in his teaching vocation, guided a group of new educators on adaptive teaching techniques. His experience on the streets had transformed into a valuable tool for understanding and helping others in vulnerable situations. "Helen," called Frank, approaching with an envelope in his hands. "This just arrived from UNESCO. They want to transform the program into a global model of educational public policy." The news was more than an institutional achievement. It was confirmation that small acts of compassion and courage could in fact change the world. Helen remembered her nights on the streets, how even there, among cardboard boxes and despair, she had never stopped teaching. "Sometimes I wonder," she said, looking at the starry sky above the garden, "how many other teachers are still out there, needing just a chance, a look of recognition." Julia, who had joined the group, hugged her mentor. "And that's why we continue expanding the program, isn't it? So that no educator feels alone, so that no dream of teaching is lost in the shadows." The night advanced, but no one seemed willing to leave. In the suspended garden of the cultural center, among flowers and lights, stories of overcoming intertwined with future projects. It was as if each person there was a small light, part of a larger constellation of hope and transformation. "You know what moves me the most?" asked Helen, observing that scene, seeing how each person who passes through the program becomes a source of light for others. It's an infinite cycle of renewal and hope. Richard nodded, deeply understanding the meaning of those words. Perhaps that's the true meaning of education, not just transmitting knowledge, but illuminating paths, building bridges, transforming lives. In the center of the garden, a new maple sapling had been planted to mark the program's anniversary. Like that small tree, Resilient Educators continued to grow, extending its branches, offering shelter and hope to those who, like Helen once, needed just a chance to bloom again. The main auditorium of the UN in New York was filled with expectation. Delegates from various countries, educators and social activists had gathered for the presentation of the Resilient Educators Program as a global model of social transformation. In the front row, Helen took a deep breath, preparing to share her story with the world. Julia, now a respected researcher in inclusive education, adjusted the microphone on her mentor's blazer. "Remember what you always told me when I was nervous before presentations. Our story is bigger than our fear." Helen smiled, touched by the memory. She observed the diverse audience, faces of different nationalities, all united by the same purpose of transforming education into a real tool for social change. Among them, she could see Richard, Frank, and Dr. Marina, who had traveled to offer their support in this historic moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," began the session president, "today we have the honor of receiving a project that has revolutionized how we deal with educators in vulnerable situations. A program that began with a personal story and transformed into a global movement." Helen rose and walked to the podium. The images on the screen behind her showed significant moments of the last 3 years. The first literacy class, the inauguration of the Cultural Center, the international expansions of the program, smiling faces of teachers who had found a new path. 3 years ago, she began, her voice clear and emotional, "I was just another invisible person on the streets of New York, a former teacher who had lost everything except her desire to teach. Even in the most difficult moments, among cardboard boxes and loneliness, I continued sharing knowledge with other homeless people." The audience listened in respectful silence, many of them already familiar with her story through the documentary that had circulated internationally. "What happened next," she continued, "wasn't just my story of personal redemption. It was the awakening of a collective conscience about how we treat our educators, about how we allow those who dedicate their lives to illuminating minds to end up in the shadows of society." On the screen, images of the program in different countries succeeded one another. A rural school in Mexico where retired teachers had created a mutual support network, a recovery center in Colombia where homeless educators returned to teaching, a teaching cooperative in Portugal founded by program beneficiaries. Resilient Educators is not just an assistance program, explained Helen. It's a movement of human reconnection, of restoring dignity through education. Each teacher we rescue becomes a beacon of hope for dozens of others. Dr. Marina rose to present the results of a global research on the program's impact. Significant reduction in profession abandonment rates, improvement in educators' mental health, strengthening of community bonds through education. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, intervened Julia, joining Helen on stage. The true impact is in transformed lives, in recovered dreams, in restored hope. Frank, who had coordinated the program's international expansion, shared the next steps. We're developing a digital platform that will allow connecting educators in vulnerable situations with support networks in real time, anywhere in the world. Richard, observing everything from the front row, remembered that first hearing where he had reunited with Helen. How a decision made in a moment of compassion had triggered a wave of transformations that now reached global proportions. Today, continued Helen, her voice laden with emotion, I am not here just as a survivor, but as a witness to the transformative power of education and solidarity. Each person in this room has the power to be an agent of change, to extend a hand to someone who needs just an opportunity. On the screen, a new image appeared, the suspended garden of the Cultural Center, where dozens of teachers recovered by the program now cultivated not just flowers, but renewed hopes and dreams. This is just the beginning, she concluded, looking at the attentive faces in the audience. Each story of overcoming is a seed that, planted in the fertile soil of solidarity, can bloom anywhere in the world. The presentation ended with a historic announcement. The UN had decided to incorporate the Resilient Educators program as part of its Sustainable Development Goals, guaranteeing resources and support for its global implementation. As applause echoed through the auditorium, Helen felt silent tears run down her face. They weren't tears of sadness or pain, like those she had shed so many times on the streets. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of certainty that even in the darkest nights, there is always the possibility of a new dawn. The sun was rising over New York when Helen returned to the place where it had all begun, the outdoor area of Bella Vita Restaurant. The space, once surrounded only by fences and prejudices, now housed a small community library, the result of a partnership between the restaurant and the Resilient Educators program. "It's strange to be here again," she commented to Julia, who accompanied her on this symbolic visit. "But now I see how each moment, even the most difficult ones, had a greater purpose." The library, named Seeds of Light, operated 24 hours a day, offering not just books but also a safe and welcoming space for people in vulnerable situations. On the walls, photographs told stories of transformation, teachers who had passed through the program and now helped others find their way back. "Teacher Helen," called a familiar voice. It was Maria Jones, arriving for her volunteer shift at the library. The lady who had learned to read through the program now coordinated reading circles for other homeless people. "I have a surprise for you," smiled Maria Jones, taking a book from her bag. It was a collection of stories written by students of the program, with a preface by Helen herself. "It arrived from the printer this morning. The first copy is yours." Helen leafed through the book emotionally, recognizing in its pages the echoes of her own journey. Each story told there was a testimony of how education could be a light in the darkness, a way back to dignity. Richard and Frank arrived shortly after, bringing the latest news about the program. The international expansion continued to grow, with new centers being inaugurated in different countries. But more important than that, the systemic changes that had begun there in that small piece of New York now reverberated in public policies around the world. "You know what's most incredible?" commented Frank, observing the movement of people entering and leaving the library. "How a story of pain can transform into a source of hope for so many others." Dr. Marina, who had also joined the group, shared the most recent results of her research on the program's impact. "It's not just about rescuing people from vulnerability. It's about reconnecting society with its deepest values of compassion and solidarity." A group of education students, led by Julia, arrived for another day of volunteer work. Among them, some were children of teachers who had passed through the program, creating a virtuous cycle of transformation through generations. "Helen," called Peter, who now coordinated the national network of support for educators, "I need to show you something." On the screen installed in the library, a live transmission showed simultaneous inaugurations of program centers in different countries. From Manila to Mexico City, from Lisbon to Johannesburg, similar stories of teachers finding their way back, through education and solidarity. "It's like a constellation," observed Julia, looking at the map dotted with lights. "Each point represents a transformed life, a story of new beginning." Helen sat on one of the library benches, absorbing the meaning of that moment. Around her, people read, conversed, shared dreams and hopes. The space that had once been her last resort for shelter was now a portal of transformation for so many others. "Do you know what this means?" asked Richard, sitting beside her. "It means that no story of pain is the final chapter. Each challenge can be the beginning of something extraordinary." The sun was already high when Helen gathered everyone for a special moment. It was time to plant a new tree in the library garden, a yellow maple, symbol of renewal and hope. "This tree," she said as her hands touched the earth, "represents each person who has passed or will pass through here. Its roots are our stories of struggle. Its branches are our recovered dreams. Its flowers are the beauty that emerges when we don't give up on believing." As the group gathered around the young tree, Helen looked up at the blue sky of New York. Somewhere in the city, perhaps at that exact moment, someone needed help, a look of recognition, a chance to start over. "Our story doesn't end here," she smiled, embracing Julia. "In fact, it's just beginning. Because as long as there's an educator needing support, a person seeking knowledge, a dream asking to be realized, We will continue being seeds of hope, lights in the darkness, bridges to new beginnings. The gentle morning breeze swayed the leaves of the new tree,